So thank you very much for coming back in a timely manner from your coffee break. We are going to continue in this panel discussion. We're going to continue to focus on some of these biological risks. And we're going to move on to the second and third presentations at this point in time. You really do have a treat in store. These, I think, are going to be the highlight of the entire conference. Now that we've engaged with Sam, I can say that without feeling guilty. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Jo Husbands, who, as you've heard, is from the National Academies, and she's going to be talking about competing catastrophes, which is a particularly apt topic. Jo.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to this group. It's been a wonderful conference to listen across such a variety of areas of research about some things which seem to be common themes and problems, and some of which are quite specialized concerns. Before I start my talk, I just want to add one thing on to the end of the conversation we were having before coffee, which is to consider as potential allies in the life sciences the people who are trying to change the way in which undergraduate biology is taught, with more active learning methods, more engagement of students. And in our experience, they are very open to the kinds of examples that will help engage students, and security examples are very useful in that regard. And certainly in the United States, there are a number of very strong networks devoted to improving teaching, and I'm sure that's true in other countries. And so if one is looking for allies, that's a place I would suggest we look. Now, segue. What I want to talk about, well, here's a quick, not very informative outline of what I'm going to offer you today, which is one proposal, two messages, and a couple of case studies, quick case studies. I want to start with the characteristics of the international policy landscape for dealing with biorisks. And this is a very policy-driven project, talk about work that colleagues and I have been doing for over a decade on trying to engage scientists in thinking about biorisks. So as we heard earlier, it's a weak regime internationally, although I think the norm is quite strong. One of the characteristics is, like many international problems, you have multiple organizations, national, regional, international, that have some role in trying to address biorisks. And it's a very wide and varied set of stakeholders who need to be involved. And in this case, without ignoring the value of those other stakeholders, the work I'm going to be talking about is scientists and the concerns that have come up, particularly in the last 15 years or so, about potential risks from research. And absolutely to underscore what you heard about the relative lack of awareness among practicing scientists, but also to add what we've talked about less is that when these issues arise, one of the characteristics that you find are continuing controversies both about the nature of the risks and about the remedies that might be applied. And I'm going to offer in this case a suggestion that I haven't heard arise in the context of the other issues we've been talking about, and I'd be very interested in the discussion to hear whether it's an issue for others, and that is what I call competing catastrophes. And this little chart is from a US-based NGO called the International Council for the Life Sciences. And it's the spectrum of biorisk. And all I want to underscore is that one end you have pandemics, naturally occurring pandemics. And at the other end, you have biowarfare, either terrorism or state programs. And in the context of biorisks that we're talking about, these debates often become arguments about, well, what's the greater threat? And could the research itself, this was the gain of function controversy, which we'll talk about later, could the research itself lead to enabling or even in some cases causing pandemics or risk of pandemics? Or is the threat of one catastrophe so great, pandemics, and remember in that very first talk, the UK national rankings of risk, which put an influenza pandemic very high in terms of risk, if not in terms of likelihood. So that I think this is something I would just like to introduce into the conversation. My least favorite phrase is nature is the best bioterrorist, as a way to kind of kill a conversation. But I'd like to put this into the mix, and as I said, I'd be very interested in hearing about whether other fields have this same sort of tension, perhaps not quite as starkly. So again, in working with the communities I do, we're looking for a way to frame biorisks that can engage many stakeholders, that facilitates reaching a wide array of scientists, that is compatible with some of the more security-focused approaches, and that is complementary to a legal and regulatory structure and gives you a basis for conversations. And just very quickly, a quick aside on framing. The term has come up often, or we've referred to narratives throughout the conference. There's several fields in social science that study this. It's very generally a set of concepts about how we structure and communicate reality. And from the study of communications, or say fields like marketing, it's about how to design and convey messages so that you increase the chances that those messages are understood and accepted. And so that can either be an object of study, that is, how are these messages constructed, how do policy debates evolve in terms of the messaging, or it can actually be, this is the best way to frame an issue to be most effective, and it's in that latter context that I'm talking about the work we've been doing. So the proposal has been for a while to frame these issues as responsible science, to embed the security issues within other questions about what is the responsible conduct of science, what is the social responsibility of science to the broader community. Among other things, it's deliberately putting an emphasis on responsibility rather than requirements. It's the very natural instinct of people in the security community to talk about legal obligations, requirements. Our experience is that that's much less effective than a broader conversation about responsibilities and roles. And so what we've been doing in our work is we're trying to do two things. One is by using this framing to increase the engagement of scientists with security issues. And we're also trying to persuade the security community, the policy community more broadly, to use this framing as they approach scientists. So rather than we've got security concerns, and we think you might contribute to those concerns, which is, I would argue, a much less effective framing to, again, use this responsible conduct approach. And there are some reasons why we think this matters. One is that it enables you to build on an existing culture of responsibility, not a perfect one by any means, but there is an existing culture, and you can take advantage of an increasingly global conversation, a broader conversation about responsible research. And these are just some examples of things that contribute to that existing culture in the sciences, whether it's norms in biosafety. And I would also say that self-governance came up earlier, that one of the interesting things in the European Academies report on gain-of-function research was the very explicit statement that supporting self-governance does not mean that scientists should be able to do whatever they want to do. If you work in the space I work in, that's a significant statement and potential change of attitude on which one could build in designing engagement. In terms of the international attention, and it depends a bit on the fields, I think, that are represented here, science is increasingly a global enterprise, and life sciences is increasingly a profoundly global enterprise, and there's a lot of effort going into building common understandings to enable collaborations to go forward. And, the need to respond to some pretty significant ethical lapses. And these conversations are genuinely international, which in terms of what we do is a big advantage. It's again grounded in the social responsibility of science, with the notion that with some freedom to do research comes responsibility. And again, if you believe words matter, the International Council for Science, which is a large umbrella organization of many professional societies, changed the name of its committee, which used to be the Committee on Freedom in the Conduct of Science, is now the Committee on Freedom and Responsibility in the Conduct of Science. Again, I believe words matter. I think that is something on which one can build for the kinds of conversations we've been talking about. And there are a lot of different sources where you can see some of this having its effect. The other message is that you want to make science part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's been one of the concerns from some of the older and sometimes continuing approaches to engaging scientists in security issues, is that they aren't framed in ways that are accessible. I think, we've already heard the example of the FBI's work and how they're trying to change that as well. And I think it also tries to build on the fact that science, as we heard earlier, there's a powerful process of socialization and acculturation within science, for which scientific organizations, scientists, the PI in a laboratory have enormous influence. And if we can engage some of those organizations in helping us transmit these messages, we think we'll stand a better chance. And so I want to illustrate that with the example of something called the Inter-Academy Partnership, which is a network of 130 academies of science and medicine. And the point, we began working in about 2004, 2005. And at that point, if you think back, Sam was talking about post 9/11 and the anthrax mailings. It's the George W. Bush administration. And for those of us who were concerned about potential biorisks, having the predominant voice expressing concerns about potential risks of research coming from the U.S. government was not going to be a positive thing. Let's put it that way. That we needed other voices. And so there was a deliberate effort to engage the science community in providing those kinds of voices. There are other voices obviously needed, but that was what we wanted to do. That would help us open doors to a broader conversation. So IAP mobilized its member academies. There's something called a biosecurity working group. You can see its current membership. Professor Shinwari and I both work through that working group. You can see if you think about an international context, if you think about, say, a United Nations context, this is an extremely useful set of countries to have involved. And a lot of what the Security Working Group has done is to engage with international organizations. Biological Weapons Convention, Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, which implements the Chemical Weapons Convention. The 1540 Committee is a UN body that implements UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which is a binding Security Council resolution to put an obligation on states to prevent terrorism. So it's intended to complement the existing treaties that prohibit state activity, but to ensure that it's very clear that there are also state obligations to deal with non-state actors. And all of the activities that we're doing vis-a-vis these organizations and nationally use this responsible science framing. We also do education institutes. My colleagues have done a number in Middle East, North Africa, in Southeast Asia. Let me just finish a sentence, Jamie. With the notion that, as you've all experienced from other fields, the challenge for engaging faculty is a crowded curriculum. You know, do I get a new course on synthetic biology, or do I get to talk about ethical issues in science? And so networking, creating networks of faculty who share these interests is a great help. There are also a lot of local activities by national academies, and you'll hear about the activities in Pakistan from Professor Shinwari. Some signs of what we think is success. One of the things that IAP does is produce statements, and so you've had a number of statements that actually relate to potential security issues, also use the responsible conduct framing. And there's a very nice policy report called Responsible Conduct in the Global Research Enterprise that's worth looking at generally, because it deals broadly. It deals with plagiarism, mentorship. It's really about how you facilitate global collaboration, but it's got security embedded within it. And this, Malcolm Dando mentioned yesterday, there's a very nice small education handbook, and this could be used more broadly than just with students. And again, it embeds preventing the misuse of research and technology as part of this broader issue of responsible conduct of science, prepared by a genuinely global committee. The co-chairs were from Germany and India, and it's a free PDF originally only in English. We just got an Arabic translation over the summer, which was really, and we're trying to move. Now we want French, because then we can get the Middle East, North Africa, and Africa. So we'll keep moving. And obviously Chinese is a high priority. It comes to Princeton University Press, also for hard copies. And on the other side, as I said, we also want to be able to persuade policymakers to use this kind of framing in approaching the science community. So here are just some examples of statements from various bodies that have picked up the either culture of responsibility, responsible conduct. Obviously, if you think about framing, we prefer it when they say build upon or extend the existing culture rather than promote or create. But we're quite happy to see this coming, and we think that's a good sign for future engagement. And let me at least introduce the gain-of-function controversy, and then we can talk about it further. This began in the fall of 2011 when a group of researchers, when researchers funded by the National Institutes of Health in the Netherlands and at the University of Wisconsin submitted papers to Science and Nature on certain experiments with highly pathogenic avian influenza. They were trying to determine under what conditions avian influenza would become transmissible between mammals. And the animal model happens to be ferrets. And when Sam mentioned the statement from the publishers, most major science publishing groups have some review mechanism to flag biosecurity concerns. So the Nature group does, Science, the American Society for Microbiology, which has 11 journals. There's quite a good percentage of the top journals in the life sciences have some mechanism for reviewing manuscripts. And reviewers at Nature and Science both flagged these journals, these submitted papers. They then went to a body which Sam had mentioned called the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity for review. The board initially recommended that the papers not be published unless certain information was redacted. That set off an enormous controversy. The board, with further information, including assertions about the feasibility under the current U.S. grant structure of actually doing that, doing redactions, the board voted again, one a unanimous support for publication, the other a split vote. Both papers were eventually published.
Can I just
yes.
add one little
Sure.
caveat there, and that the papers were modified.
Yes.
In light of discussions at the NSABB. So, but it's often presented as they were published without.
Oh, you're done. Absolutely.
But so there was the public presentation of academic freedom won this fight, and then there's the reality of there were modifications in light of addressing the security concerns around the work.
Yeah. And there were editorial, as is often recommended, there were commentaries accompanying the papers to explain what the issues had been. And I think that's also an important part of how this conversation goes forward. And the U.S. government put in place policies, which Sam alluded to, and first for its own review of research, and then later for the responsibilities of research performing institutions that receive federal funding for research in this category. What it became was a debate over whether certain types of experiments should be conducted at all. One of the interesting features was that it posed policy and regulatory challenges at a number of levels. Again, there were some of the research was performed in the Netherlands, so the Dutch government became involved in this. The European Commission became involved, in part because it was also funding research in some comparable areas. What about harmonization? Would they fund research in the Netherlands or elsewhere that wouldn't be funded by US to the same laboratory? Anyway, interesting questions. And then international questions for the World Health Organization, because again, this was part of the broader international campaign to try to address the risks of pandemic influenza, and the Biological Weapons Convention. And there's been a long and very painful US policy process to try to deal with this. We can talk about that in greater detail, but that's a whole talk in and of itself. Yep.
What I was going to ask is, what do you think would have happened if these authors submitted to a less prestigious journal? Because at least in some sense we did at least catch it because it was submitted to Science and Nature. There's a very large proliferation of lower impact journals.
Yes.
And so, is there patent stuff floating around that literature no one's looked at yet, which poses similar challenges, but we just aren't aware of them because...
Yes. Yes. And if you think about the advent of online publishing, the notion of addressing these issues at the stage of publication is, let's just say, it's problematic.
Maybe a bit late.
And that's been a continuing issue an effort over the last at least 15 years to think about ways in which one might be able to capture these issues upstream in the process. Because if you wait for publication, you're flying in the face of all of the incentives in the research community. And also, if you have graduate students or postdocs, or particularly from other countries, and suddenly research on which they've been working is considered problematic for security, there are a lot of issues involved in waiting for the publication stage to consider whether or not research might pose serious concerns. And again, this was the classic, gain of function is the classic competing catastrophes. This is about research to prevent a global influenza pandemic. That's how it started. It later encompassed SARS and MERS, the two emerging infectious diseases. And there's controversy across all of the claims of risk and all of the claims of this is just a classic case if you follow what these debates become. But one of the things that's interesting about this debate as opposed to some of the other countries is there was genuine dispute within the scientific community. This was not just the scientists here and security people here. There were actually competing advocacy groups formed. My favorite is that somebody filed for the domain name of Scientists for Science, which was immediately followed by somebody else filing for Scientists for Responsible Science. So framing matters. But more seriously, this really is, this was quite remarkable. And the piece I'm going to pick up is simply that Academies of Science organizations had a lot of engagement in this. There was a White House-led process that's still going on to determine a U.S. policy to deal with this research. And our academy did 2 public meetings, one on how to think about the risks and benefits and the other policy. And as I said, the European Commission asked for a study on the options based on competing letters from different groups of scientists in Europe. And the Dutch government had engaged its academy in a policy review. So I'm highlighting this because I think it's worth looking at how not just academies, but science organizations, the science community gets involved and engaged in these debates. And it's much of the debate involved used framing around responsible science. I was very encouraged by that. And if you look at the conclusions of both the advisory report from the National Science Advisory Board on Biosecurity and the European Commission, I think and the report from the Inter-Academy Partnership, I believe you can begin to see some principles for what responsible conduct of research would look like to address biorisks that to me gives you a very interesting basis for discussion, conversation, and undoubtedly disputation. And with that, I'll thank you very much. One thing, I don't know if the slides will be distributed, but I've put up URLs for a number of the materials, because almost everything I was talking about is available online, and you're welcome to contact me if you'd like any directions to these further materials.
So I'm thinking that we do the presentations together because they are going to be on similar subjects. But I saw 4 hands go up. Do you want to ask those questions now, or do you want to hang on? Yeah. Okay. So at least one of the questions for now.
Really quickly, the sort of competing catastrophes debate in the scientific community is fascinating, and I think it has a direct tie to the kinds of questions that people ask themselves when they care about global catastrophic risk. And so I'm really curious to know, we're trying to figure out how to resolve that question internally. So, at the Philanthropy Project, we're trying to reduce global catastrophic risk posed by pandemics. And so we have debates about, well, which of these 3 threat streams is going to be most likely to cause a global catastrophic risk to define it. And I personally think that, while there are interest groups around it, there isn't rigorous analysis out there that really breaks this down. So I don't know, I think that would be useful, at least for this community of interest, but I'm curious to know if you think that's at all worthwhile for what you're talking about, or is it just so polarized at this point that it's just not going to be resonant with those communities?
The gain of function debate is very polarized. One of the things, I do think it would be valuable to try to sort this out. One of the things I had reinforced for me by this conference is the degree to which the life sciences community does not seem to be particularly well embedded in broader discussions about how one handles risks that are low probability, high consequence. And I think there could be some very positive comparative discussions of how that risk particular problem is handled in different communities, because there's a tendency in a lot of, I said, well, we can't say anything useful. And that doesn't make sense. But moving from a reaction of that doesn't make sense to here's a set of information about how other communities deal with it is something that I think could be really valuable. And it seems to me that's a Caesar-like task. And I'd be astounded if there isn't good information.
Well, there's another question, 2 questions down here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let's say, at the risk of, we're all here very nice people, and so we like to talk about motivating good behavior and responsible science. And but I know that in the in the field of software engineering, lots of ISO 9000 conventions and normative protocols for responsible software development have not prevented a huge proliferation of computer viruses that also spread very rapidly. And my concern is that if there's an accident with biotechnology research, the public are not going to care about our normative protocols and so on. They'll say, your carrots are all very fine, but we want to find the culprits and we want to stick to beat them.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Don't you think that it would be good for us as scientists to do some preemptive thinking about what sanctions could be available, what stick could be? Should we not have some input into the choice of the stick that the public will decide about when there's an accident?
Yeah.
And thinking in particular in analogy with computer viruses, the villains have often benefited from anonymity. Can we prevent anonymity in biotechnology research? Can we prevent scientists from, can we prevent beneficial owners from hiding behind limited liability companies? I'd love to hear from all the speakers.
Yep.
So that sounds like a good jumping off point for our discussions when we've got both presentations out of the way. Have you got a quick comment on this, and then we'll go on?
Well, it was the previous question. I wonder whether moving away from a risk-only approach, because I'm sure there are papers saying we can't know every risk, towards flexible response capacity and no regrets preparedness. Because perhaps that particularly applies with pandemics and novel viruses. There's always going to be something you can prepare for. And it was precisely because the funding for the WHO department responsible was cut, that they didn't have the right people in West Africa to pick that up. Was that, well, details.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.